What is the worst of all possible sins? Is it brutality, rape, murder? Well, church fathers like Augustine and Aquinas saw those as true evils, but they also understood all evils first from putting our inner desires before God. Thus, it is the sin of pride they held as the root of every other kind of evil, and it's the worst of all possible sins. Hi everyone, I'm Lenny Esposito, and in this podcast I'll be looking at a sin that's too often ignored or overlooked today, especially so in the church. The practice of vainglory, a word you may not have heard, is subtly malicious, and as C.S. Lewis noted, it's able to transform a good man into an absolute scoundrel. Why in the 21st century we are more in danger of falling prey to them than ever before. I'll also be highlighting how very visible Christians have been corrupted by this sin and why it's so dangerous through its insidiousness. We're going to be tackling vainglory and pride on this Come Let Us Reason Together. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day, nice spring morning. Everything's nice and shiny, right? Seats are comfortable? Yeah. That's good, because actually they may not be by the end of this message. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. We have been going through the book of Romans, and I'm using this chapter as a bit of a springboard, but you'll see its relevance as we move through it. My message today is entitled The Most Insidious Sin. And it prompts the question, what is the worst sin? What would you think? Is it perhaps murder? I don't know if you've read the headlines. Last Wednesday in Frisco, Texas, 17-year-old Austin Metcalf was at a track meet and was stabbed in the heart by another 17-year-old boy, Carmelo Anthony, after an altercation. According to witnesses, Anthony, quote, got upset after being told he was sitting in the wrong spot. Metcalf's twin brother tried to stop the bleeding, but it was obviously too late. Now we hear this, and this just seems like a violent overreaction to a situation. Certainly such blatant disregard for human life is terrible. Would that be the worst sin? Well, we can think of other sins as well. What about sexual sin? It's interesting, in our culture, while sex is pervasive, both in media, in advertising, in our day-to-day lives, we can all think of pastors, highly regarded individuals, who were looked up to until they had a moral failing. And then it immediately disbarred them. In fact, when we find church leaders who've fallen in this way, it becomes hard for us to imagine returning them to the pulpit as a leading figure in the way they had been. When those deeds come to light, ministry afterwards is tougher to grasp. It seems that such sin is disqualifying. And, of course, it damages so many people in so many ways. So could that be the worst sin? And aren't these the ones that Jesus actually highlighted in his Sermon on the Mount, right? You have heard it said, thou shalt not murder. You have heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery. He seems to point in that direction. But what if these aren't the worst sins? What if there's a type of sin that's actually more deadly than murder, more destructive than sexual sin, yet we don't notice it and many times encourage it? Now, in the book of Romans, we get a taste of this contrast, because in chapter 1, of course, there's the famous passage about men leaving the natural inclinations that they should have and burning in their hearts one for another. Paul famously addresses this problem of homosexuality that was rampant in the Gentile world. But in chapter 2, he turns his attention to the Jewish cohort in Rome, and he says they have problems too. Now, Judaism had a long tradition of eschewing such sexual proclivities. They understood that that was sinful, and they wouldn't at least blatantly fall into it. They may surreptitiously fall into it, but that's a different story. But Paul in Romans chapter 2 focuses on a different sin. And he focuses on the primary sin that had plagued the Israelites ever since they were called out of Egypt. Pride. Pride is the issue that we're dealing with. And I maintain that pride is the most dangerous and the most insidious sin, because sinful pride can be hard to spot sometimes. It can look like self-confidence. And shouldn't we be proud of the things that we do, the items that we've accomplished, the places where we've gone and pulled ourselves in? Pride can masquerade itself as a virtue, because you can be proud of things that you do very well. Excellence. We all wish to achieve excellence, and we can be proud in that. Now, our culture cheers on pride more than it cheers on sexual proclivities, believe it or not. Hard to believe in today's day. But even those, I think, in the church can miss some of its destructive capacities and its corrupting nature when we look at sin in its improper context, or when we look at pride in its improper context. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at two aspects or two functions that we tend to, in today's world, group under the category of pride. But the medieval fathers really understood these as two different aspects or two different vices. The first one is pride proper, and the second one is the sin of vainglory. So let me unpack all this for you so you know where we're going. First of all, if you remember when we met before, we talked about ordered loves. If you remember that message. God created us in the universe in an orderly way. He created the universe in an orderly way, and there is an order to things, right? You have been made a little lower than the angels for a time, but we are made to ultimately rule and reign over the angels. So there is a proper order. We are to rule and reign over creation. One of the problems in the Garden of Eden was Adam and Eve listened to the snake. They were supposed to be kings ruling over the created order. Instead, they listened to the created order and followed his advice. That started a whole chain reaction. But when we talked about ordered loves, we actually talked about how loving God is the primary, right? This is the proper order of things. You love God first. You love your neighbor, say, more than your body. So you do for others, right? And this is reflected in Jesus' teaching. If you heard it, compel you to go 1 mile, you go 2, this idea. But this idea of order in creation also filters down not only to our loves, but our desires. Those things that pull us, those things that we wish to do, our felt needs. Now, we have a name for these ideas. If you are properly ordered in your desires, those desires are called virtues. And we practice the virtues, right? And we read the fruits of the Spirit, gentleness, self-control, things of that nature. If they're disordered, however, if they're going to another direction, we have a word for that too. Those are called vices. And pride is the primary vice. So an ordered desire, a virtue, is something that properly leads one into a right understanding of oneself in relation to God or in relation to other people. If you understand that others are more valuable than yourself, then it would lead to traits like kindness, humility, self-sacrifice, right? That's what you would do. If you understand your relation to God properly, it's not, do I have to go and worship God again? It's, I need to go and worship God again. I want to be close to Him. I want to have that relationship. So an ordered desire is one that properly leads one into a right understanding of oneself, and then disordered desire takes you away from that. So let's look at pride. Proper pride would be doing an excellent job for the sake of a customer, let's say, right? You can be proud in your work, and because you want them to have the best item or experience that they have. Galatians 6:4, Paul writes, "Let each person examine his own work, and then he can take pride in himself alone and not compare himself with someone else." So here's an example of Paul saying you can take pride in yourself if you're doing the best that you can do. That pride isn't, look at me, I'm so great. That pride is, look, I wanted to give this to him because he deserves the best from me. That's a distinction. Basically, it's a version of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Proper pride in worship is to seek to understand God and not to misrepresent Him, either to yourself or to others. So, Psalm 27, some take pride in chariots, others in horses, but we take pride in the name of the Lord our God. This was Israel's goal, or this is how they should have exercised their pride. This is also one of the reasons why when Solomon starts building all the horse stables, God starts looking at him askance. He's like, that's actually sin. You're starting to trust in horses the way all the Gentiles do. You don't need cavalry. You have me. You don't need tanks. You have me. You're supposed to call on the Lord. Don't you remember when I pulled you out of Egypt? All Moses had to do was pray, and we would win the battle. And if his arms fell, we didn't bring in more horses and more tanks. We brought in 2 guys to hold up his arms. Also, 2 Corinthians 1:14, Paul tells the Corinthian church, just as you have partially understood us, that we are your reason for pride, and just as you also are ours in the day of the Lord Jesus. Paul is proud in the sense that, hey, I am doing this service, and these people are getting to know God, and I am proud because I'm giving God the best that I can give Him. So it's a difference between seeking self-aggrandizement and looking for another. You can study the scriptures to learn as much as you can to rightly divide the word of truth. That's proper pride. That's proper ordered desire. What's a disordered desire? Well, a disordered desire distorts our relationship to God and to others. And if we're talking about pride specifically, pride is a belief or a desire towards superiority. You either believe you are superior or you're striving towards it, right? You want to be better than that other guy. It's inward. It's self-reflective. It's not outward. It's not God-reflective. And we see this in 1 John. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not from the Father, but from the world. So here we have the pride of life, right? And God even tells us in Zephaniah when he's chastising Moab and Ammon. Now remember, Moab and Ammon, they're not Canaanite cities. They come from Lot. So they're part of the lineage that's of the same family of Abraham. But remember, during the Exodus, they wouldn't let the Jewish people cross over through their land, right? And God tells them through Zephaniah, this is what they get for their pride, because they have taunted and acted arrogantly against the people of the Lord of armies. So you see, that's a disordered pride. And in all these examples, man is elevating himself, either above other men, as the people of Moab and Ammon, or above God himself. And this really was the original sin. It was Satan who elevates himself above God, right? What did he tell Jesus in Matthew 4:8? Tempting him and saying, I will show him all the kingdoms of the world. I will give you all of these things if you fall down and do what? Worship me. No, Jesus says, you worship God alone. Satan, you're putting yourself in the wrong position. That's disordered. That's out of place. That's pride. Now, if you read about sin in the Bible, many times what you'll see is sin is likened to leaven, right? And you see this over and over again. Now, why is sin likened to leaven? How many of you are bakers? I grew up in a family of bakers. I grew up in a bakery, actually. And leaven's kind of really important because what does it do? You add it to the dough and it ferments the dough, creates air bubbles in the dough so that the dough will rise, right? But leaven, and it's sourdough, they'll use not merely just yeast, but they'll use some beer batter. There's all kinds of different sourdough starters that they can use. But all of those are actual, what you would call corrupting agents. They corrupt the dough by puffing it up. And the reason why leaven is so perfectly used as a symbol of sin is because that's what pride does. That's what sin does. It corrupts you from within by puffing you up with air, with something that's not there. Pride is deadly because it robs God of his glory. Remember, again, the snake in the garden. Hath God said you could eat of any tree? No, we can't eat of this tree, Eve tells him, or we will surely die. In his response in Genesis 3:4, no, you will not surely die. In fact, God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now that was a lie, but notice two things. He contradicted God's authority. No, God's wrong. That's staggering by itself. And secondly, his temptation is you can pull yourself into a position where you're level with God. And what did Eve see? Remember 2 John, the tree is beautiful to look at, good for food, and desirable to make one wise. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. She fell in all three of those sins. So, pride will rob God of his glory because it pulls him down and tries to falsely elevate you into his place. Does that make sense? Secondly, it creates a barrier between ourselves and God. Pride always is something that comes between us. And when you misunderstand your reliance and relationship to God, it will always divide you from that true relationship. Now, Judah and Israel more broadly had this problem all the time. In fact, when we went through the book of Jeremiah, we heard it over and over again, right? In Ezekiel, when God is warning the people of Judah that the Babylonian invasion is coming, in verse 24-25, he says, quote, "Say to the house of Israel, this is what the Lord God says. I am about to desecrate my sanctuary, the pride of your power." See, the people of Judah kept saying things like, we have the temple. There's no way God would allow the Babylonians to conquer us because we have the temple. But see, that's disordered. It's not God they're trusting in. It's the fact that they built this building and they're using it as a talisman that God would never take down. But God says, no, I am about to desecrate my sanctuary, the pride of your power, the delight of your eyes, the desire of your heart. Oh, those three things sound familiar again? Also, the sons and daughters you left behind will fall by the sword. This pride in being Jewish, this pride in we come from Abraham, we are the chosen race, we are the ones who have the law, we are the ones who had Moses, was so embedded into their culture that they forgot to trust the God who bestowed those things upon them and trusted those things instead. And to this day, ladies and gentlemen, to this day, that is the primary barrier for the Jewish people accepting Jesus. If you want to know specifically why the gospel continues to not permeate the Jewish culture, considering all of its Jewish roots, considering its Jewish heritage and its stock, it is because of this issue of pride. Paul talks about it in Galatians. The entire book of Hebrews is about it. And here in Romans chapter 2, we see it as well. So pride robs God of his glory. It creates a barrier between ourselves and God. And it is the root from which springs all other evils. Like I said, it is the original sin, as we pointed out in Genesis 3. In book 12, chapter 6 of Confessions, Augustine argues, it's City of God. Book 12, chapter 6 of City of God, Augustine argues that both with angels and with humans, pride began the formation of an evil will. It is because people were inward looking, they were proud, that the evil started in their hearts. And out of that then follows things like murder, like avarice, like one-upmanship. And so Augustine says pride is the root of all evils, because it turns one's attention inward to oneself instead of being properly ordered outward towards God. That's pride. What is vainglory? Now here's a word we don't use much anymore. This is very medieval in its approach. And like I said, we kind of lump both of these into the word pride, but I like the distinction here, and I think it's important. If you ever seen a chart of the 7 deadly sins, usually a lot of these are shown as trees, where you have the trunk, and the trunk is usually pride, and then you have 7 sins that grow out of the trunk, 7 branches, and then you have 7 fruits of one of each of the branches. This is how Augustine kind of painted the picture. Vainglory is the first of the 7 sins. And this is a difficult sin to deal with, because of all of the sins that we look at and all of the vices, it has the most gradations, has the most subtlety to it sometimes. So what is vainglory? What am I talking about? Well, vainglory differs from pride in the fact that pride is a belief of self. It's a belief that I'm either better or I need to be better. Vainglory is simply the seeking out of others' adulation of you. You want others to see you as better or special or unique. Rebecca DeYoung, I'm actually taking a lot of this from her book called Vainglory, The Forgotten Vice. Her full name, Rebecca Koenig DeYoung, writes this: the difference roughly is that pride is about position and power, and vainglory is about attention and acknowledgement. So pride is really about the superiority of one's goodness, the goodness in the sense that you're better at something than someone else. Vainglory, on the other hand, is a disordered desire for the display of one's goodness. Put simply, the prideful person desires to be greater than others, and whether others recognize this or not doesn't matter, while the vainglorious person wishes to attract others' notice of applause, whether she is better at them or not. Okay? So there's a distinction here. So when we look at the practice of vainglory, for example, in seeking a disordered glory. Now, Augustine and actually Aquinas, when Aquinas wrote this in his Summa Theologica, he broke it down into kind of three different aspects, right? You had, number one, a proper glory is to do something that's notable. So if you are Mother Teresa and saving people in Calcutta, you're probably going to get noticed. You're probably going to get some headlines. That in and of itself is not a big deal because Mother Teresa doesn't do it to get the headlines. If there were no headlines, she'd still do it. Matter of fact, when there were no headlines, she still did it. But headlines show up as a result. The difficulty here, of course, is that there are some who can get the headlines from very noble causes with very noble motives, and then slowly and subtly get sucked into the idea that the headlines themselves are the goal instead of the work. But Aquinas says that's a noble type of glory. What vainglorious is can be found in one of three ways. First, it's on the part of the thing for which one seeks glory. In other words, a man seeking glory for that which is unworthy of glory. He gives glory to something that shouldn't be glorified, something frail and perishable. Beauty in our society. Or height. I know. I know. Personally, I don't mind my height. I figure I'm closer if I fall. You know, it's not going to hurt as much. But things like that. Beauty is frail. It's perishable. It's just here a couple of years, and then it's gone. And why should you glory in that thing? That there's nothing to it, right? Your race, something like that. So you could glorify on the part of the thing for one seeks glory that doesn't deserve it, or on the part of him from whom he seeks glory. For example, I want the adulation of the masses. I want to make sure all of the Twitter comments are giving me props. Have you seen the people on Twitter? Are you sure? You know, is that all my students love me? All your students are on kindergarten and you give them cookies every day. Of course they love you, right? That's not proper glory. That's vaingloriousness, because that judgment doesn't withstand scrutiny. And thirdly, and most often, on the part of the person himself who seeks glory. He does not refer to the desires of his own glory to a due end, such as God's honor. He just wants people to look at him. So in other words, vaingloriousness is to be thought of as special, and it doesn't matter whether you're special or not. Now, you could be prideful and like a phenomenal jazz musician and get all the bad reviews, and you say, well, they just don't understand me. I don't care. But you could still have pride in that, even though nobody gives you adulation. See, that's the difference between pride. Vainglory, it doesn't matter whether the music's good or not. You just want people to tell you it's good. So you see the difference between pride and vaingloriousness. When Augustine talks about this, and you remember the story with the pears? When he went to steal the pears with his friends, and he said, we just wanted to do it because we wanted the thrill of the steal. When he talks about vaingloriousness, he noticed this. He goes, as soon as the words are spoken, let's go and do it, one becomes ashamed not to be shameless. Peer pressure. If they're all going to break the law, I can't resist them. I have to go, even though maybe I don't want to, but it's vaingloriousness to not go along, to be liked just for the sake of being liked. Now, if you were alive and growing up in LA in the 80s, you would have seen a great example of vaingloriousness. These billboards started appearing all over Los Angeles during that day. This is before the internet existed. And Angeline made the newspapers. She made the evening reports, and she was well known in this area. Why? Because she paid money to have billboards of herself put up all over Los Angeles. Angeline was famous for the sake of being famous. And that was a big deal. Now, we don't have that today, do we? What have these people ever done? Why did they get the television show? What's going on here? No, this is called vaingloriousness. This is it in spades, folks. This is how our culture works. And the Jewish people, Paul warns in Romans chapter 2, are absolutely guilty of this idea of vaingloriousness. Let's look at our chapter, Romans chapter 2, starting in verse 17. Paul writes, "Now, if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve the things that are superior, being instructed from the law, and if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light to those in darkness, an instructor of the ignorant, a teacher of the immature, having the embodiment of knowledge and truth in the law, then you who teach another, don't you teach yourself? You who preach, you must not steal. Do you steal? You who say, you must not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? You who detest idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you." Now, Paul is doing in this section what he did in Romans chapter 1, okay? He's using extreme examples to make a point. In Romans chapter 1, I don't think Paul was dressing down the Christian believers for idolatry and homosexuality. I think he's using the worst examples of the Roman culture and saying, look, this is where the Gentiles have problems and you're part of that group. So don't think that you're coming from pure stock. Now he's turning to the Jews and doing the same thing. It turns out that Josephus does write of an incident where a couple were accused of stealing offerings that were supposed to go to the temple. And when he says, you who detest items, do you rob temples? So it's like a newspaper clipping. But the idea of stealing, committing adultery, again, we've heard what Jesus said in those passages, right? You have heard it said, thou shalt not murder. I say to you, if you even call your neighbor on the 91 freeway an idiot and throw off a couple of hand signals, you're guilty of murder, right? If you even lust after a woman, you're guilty of committing adultery. So Paul is using those, and it's funny that I find it fascinating that Paul uses the very two examples that Jesus used in his illustration here. Maybe Paul heard the Sermon on the Mount. By the way, Romans was written before Mark, before the first Gospels were written. So the fact that those teachings were already circulating is an interesting point. But hear the language that he's using. You call yourself a Jew. You say you rely on the law. What are they proud of? They're proud of their heritage. They're proud that they are alive. They boast in God. Is that proper boasting, like Psalm 20, or is that maybe being vainglorious? We have God. Again, remember the context we have here. In 49 AD, 47, the Jews were kicked out of Rome. And Priscilla and Aquila and some of those people of the church went as well, leaving only the Gentiles in the church. Now the Jewish believers are starting to filter back into Rome. And I don't think it a big stretch to say that when they come into, you Gentiles don't know what you're doing. Look, this is our faith, this is our religion, let me show you. Just like what happened in Galatia. No, you need to be circumcised. You really need to be, before you can do any of this, you need to be circumcised. You need to follow kosher laws. You need to, right? Well, why should we do that? That doesn't say, we weren't taught that by, but we're the Jews. We're the special people of God. You need to listen to us, right? We know His will. We approve the things that are superior. We are instructed from the law. We are convinced that we are a guide to the blind. Do you hear this? It's pretty clear. That guide to the blind thing, that's pretty interesting. Did you know in Isaiah 42 that that's a claim that God actually makes? Isaiah 42:16, and I will lead the blind by a road they do not know, and I will cause them to tread on paths they have not known. I will make darkness in their presence into light. It sounds like the Jews are a little disordered here. It sounds like they're putting themselves in the wrong spot. So Paul has to say, you're the instructor of the ignorant. Are you failing at the very things you're telling other people not to do? You better be careful. You better be careful. For it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Now, Augustine, when studying vaingloriousness, notes that there are 7 vices that follow from it. The children of vainglory, I call them. And the first, he breaks them into 2 parts. He has offensive verses, offensive meaning proactive. These are things that I use to try and get adulation, to try and get people to see me as special in some way, shape, or form. And then defensive, reactive vices. So let's go through these really quick. First is boasting. And we see this in our passage, that if you call yourself a Jew and rely on God and boast in God, right? This is pretty easy. Most people can understand boasting as a way to try and gain adulation. I don't think I have to spend a whole lot of time on that. And hypocrisy. And Pastor Tom last week talked a lot about hypocrisy, where the idea of hypocrisy is to make a show of being righteous, not actually being righteous. So again, you're looking for adulation, whether or not it's deserved. Vainglory, and that's again one of the differences between that and pure pride, which means that you're actually trying to be the thing that you believe you are. So those are the first 2. But this third one, presumption of novelties. Now that sounds kind of strange, but this is where we are in culture today, folks. This is so huge. And C.S. Lewis wrote about it in his book, in his lecture, The Inner Ring. But basically, I see the presumption of novelties means that you are viewed as unique, special, different, important. It, I think, comes from the Disneyfication of our culture, and our culture has been Disneyfied way too much. We are all taught from a very young age that we're special flowers, unique in our own way, all important, right? And that idea not only sticks, but starts to grow. Hyper-individualism has dominated our society, and we get this idea of the presumption of novelties, both from the external messaging that we hear in television ads and, be the you can be, girl power, whatever the case is. But also smartphones and social media have amplified and extended this. How many clicks have I gotten? How many likes has people? Hey, I texted you, you didn't text me back. How come you didn't answer me? Do you not like me anymore? It's all about the adulation, right? FOMO, fear of missing out. Oh, I can't be considered one of those guys. Christians do this all the time. Take the picture on Instagram. We've talked about it, right? The Bible and the coffee. Monday morning prayer journal. Blessed. Hashtag. In his address to the students at King College, London, Lewis delivered what later became the essay, The Inner Ring. And there he says, this is 1949, by the way, I believe that in all men's lives at a certain periods, and in many men's lives at all periods between infancy and extreme old age, one of the most dominant elements is the desire to be inside the local ring and the terror of being left outside. So Lewis says it's the idea that you're special or that you matter more than others. He goes on to say, men tell not only their wives, but themselves that it is a hardship to stay late at the office or the school on some bit of important extra work, which they have been let in for because they and the two others, well, they're the only people left in the place who really know how things run. He writes, it's tiring and unhealthy to lose your Saturday afternoons, but to have them free because you don't matter, oh, that is much worse. How many of you know folks at work? Oh, without me, the whole place will fall apart. This is our government in spades. Every agency, every person in every agency. This is really what a lot of the left believes. The poor unwashed masses will not be able to tie their own shoes. We have to set the standard. We have to raise them up. This is where critical theory starts to show up and saying how we have to level the playing field. You can't judge people by their merit, for crying out loud. That's unfair. In the essay, Lewis goes on and talks about how this kind of temptation is a subtle corruption that can lead to the downfall of the whole person. And remember, he's addressing young college boys who are undergrads wanting to graduate and start their careers. And he says this, and the prophecy I make is this, to 9 of 10 of you, the choice which could lead to scoundrelism will come. When it does come, in no very dramatic colors. Now, obviously, bad men, obviously threatening or bribing will almost certainly appear. Over a drink or a cup of coffee disguised as a triviality and sandwiched between 2 jokes. From the lips of a man or woman whom you have recently been getting to know rather better, or whom you would hope to know better still. Just at that moment, when you are most anxious not to appear crude or naif or prig, the hint will come. It'll be a hint of something which the public, the ignorant romantic public, would never understand. Something which even the outsiders in your own profession are apt to make a fuss about. But something, says your new friend, which we, and the word we, you try not to blush for the mere pleasure, something we always do. And he says, and you will be drawn in. If you are drawn in, not by desire for gain or ease, but simply because at that moment, when the cup was so near your lips, you cannot bear to thrust back again into that cold outer world. It would be so terrible to see the other man's face, that genial, confidential, delightfully sophisticated face, turn suddenly cold and contemptuous, to know that you had been tried for that inner ring and rejected. And then, if you are drawn in, next week, it'll be something a little bit further. A little bit further from the rules. And then the next year, something further still, but all in the jolliest, friendliest spirit. It may end in a crash, a scandal, and penal servitude. It may end in millions, a peerage, and giving prizes at your old school. But you will be a scoundrel. We see this trend even in the church. We see today where people think politics and being part of the right group is what matters, showing that to everybody else. Virtue signaling happens on both sides of the political divide. what motivated me for some of this was that murder of Austin Metcalf. His father went on to be interviewed that same day. And Jeff Metcalf's statement was this. Turns out he was a Christian. They were a Christian family. He said, quote, I'm not trying to judge, but what kind of parents did this child have? What was he taught? He brought a knife to attract me, and he murdered my son by stabbing him in the heart. The guy was in the wrong place, and they asked him to move, and he bowed up. This is murder. And then he said, you know what? I already forgive this person. Already. God takes care of things. God is going to take care of me. God is going to take care of my family. Now, by the way, he's a single father. I'm not quite sure what happened to the mother. I haven't heard that yet. This statement brought reactions. Here's one. You can't forgive your son's murderer within 24 hours of the killing and never having met or spoken with that perpetrator. You're just a weak, pathetic excuse for a man. Okay, well, that's just one guy, right? I'm livid that the dad came out and forgave this murderer almost immediately. There's nothing to forgive. The thug took a life, and now his life should be taken by the state. Well, a couple of guys may not be correct. Going on TV to forgive the murderer of your child, especially right after it happened, is about the worst advertisement for Christianity imaginable. If you want to sink efforts at evangelism, this would be a way to do it. And then he adds, you can always pretend to forgive him after he's been put in front of a firing squad or given the lethal injection. So is positioning more important than the gospel here? What did Jesus do? He didn't even wait till he was dead. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. But we better not only hold to these views, we better tell everybody else so that we can get the likes. Look at that last one. 2,000 hearts, thumbs up, 34 comments. Look at the first one, 38,000 hearts. People love this stuff. As long as I get the likes. You see the danger of the perception of being unique. So, those were the offensive ways that you can do it. Here's defensive. Being obstinate, habitually insisting on your own judgment or rejecting that of a better judge. Well, that makes sense. So these were, if someone says, hey, professor, I think you're wrong here. You can't tell me that, I'm a professor. Well, let me show you the facts. I don't care about the facts. They won't say that. They'll just leverage you. Do you think that I don't know? Do you realize my standing, right? So they would reject that of a better judge, of a person who, and we see this all the time with atheism, where they draw upon their supposed knowledge. Discord. Discord would be the next one, which is refusing to, by the way, this was a fascinating topic to Google, because Vainglory, Discord, there are so many online gaming things that are using these names that it's really hard to find images for them, because I keep getting like anime and stuff like that instead. Everybody has usurped the naming conventions for their online gaming platforms. It's just fascinating. Anyway, to refuse to agree with those wiser than us would be discord. And then, of course, that can lead to contention. Quarreling, that's vainglory expressed defensively in words, and ultimately disobedience. Just choosing no. I don't care if everybody tells me I'm going to be so. Now, you have to understand that vaingloriousness isn't simply being part of the elite crowd. Part of the difficulty with this sin is you can be vainglorious in the fact that you're not part of the elite crowd. So, for example, the alt music scene or the punk scene was very proud of the fact that they weren't commercial. And you can say the ascetics, the monks, the desert monks in the early centuries of the church were worried that as they went out and practiced those pieties and those exercises of like self-denial and silence, things like that, that they could actually even get proud in how well they're doing at being godly. So it can swing the other direction. You see how difficult it is? Do you see how difficult it is to, matter of fact, when she wrote the book, DeYoung was giving a lecture on vaingloriousness, and she's going like, okay, how do I do this and give a good lecture? But when they start applauding, is that going to undercut everything I've just said? Because now they're giving me the adulation that I'm telling you that you're not supposed to be seeking for. And it becomes a difficult balancing act. You see how insidious this sin can be? Because even if you try and do everything right, you can still fall into it. So unlike other sins like murder, it's tricky. It's tricky. Vaingloriousness can corrupt the church, right? We were at a meeting yesterday, and one of my friends, we were talking about our church. And he goes, you know, the first thing that everybody asks when you're with a group of pastors is, well, how big is your church? Now, why should that matter? What does that tell you other than vaingloriousness? Well, we've got a big church. Us. I go to so-and-so's church, right? And you hear people do this in the church all the time. And nobody says, you know, you really shouldn't do that. Is that proper boasting, or is that boasting in something else? The pastor he gets on the news programs all the time. He gets interviewed, asked to go to the White House, whatever. You know, that may be more of a problem than an issue. And while sexual sin is easy to spot and quickly, for most people's minds, invalidates a person for ministry, vainglory doesn't seem to even raise a blip in most of the church. So, how do we combat this as we close? First of all, remember who your true audience is. The big word for this is magnanimity. Be magnanimous. Properly ordered glory is recognizing from where the thing that is providing glory originates. Think about elementary school kids in their first school recital. There may be 300 people in the audience. Every one of my kids didn't care about the other 298. They were only looking for 2 people. Guess who? Mom and Dad. That's who their eyes are fixed on. Did I do okay, Dad? Did I do okay? Did you see me? Did you see me? We, as Paul was trying to explain to the Jewish people, need to fix our eyes upon God. Did you see me, God? Did I do okay? Did I measure up to your standards? The rest of our text, verse 25, Paul says, circumcision benefits you if you observe the law, but if you're a lawbreaker, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So if an uncircumcised man keeps the law's requirements, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? In other words, it's not the changing of the bodily function, the bodily appearance. It's the motivation that matters. And a man who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will judge you, who are a lawbreaker, in spite of having the letter of the law and circumcision. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, and true circumcision is not something visible in the flesh. On the contrary, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart, by the Spirit, not the letter. And there's the closer. And that person's praise is not from people, but from God. That's the proper glory. That's the thing that you should get. Magnanimity. You give up your glory for the greater good. So, practice that. Practice humility. Stay silent when achievements are mentioned. This is hard to do sometimes. This is a really difficult exercise to grow in humility and magnanimity. You don't have to post your successes online. You don't have to answer the errors that other people are making online. Oh, I got a comment. Somebody's wrong on the internet. Dear me. Rebecca DeYoung, when she talks to students, she gives them this challenge. How hard would it be to fast, not from all words, but from speaking about ourselves? What would it be like not to talk about our feelings, our frustrations, daily adventures and triumphs, excuses and rationalizations, not only in person, but also on Facebook, Twitter, phones, and blogs? Imagine doing that for a day. I mean, a day's not that long. Can we pull it off? Avoiding attention. What if you were to be just like everybody else so that you don't stick out at all? There's a reason why the monks in the monasteries dressed the same, had the same haircut, did the exact same chores in the exact same way, carried the exact same schedule. Because they were worried that if they stuck out, they would grow in this vaingloriousness. And ultimately, and this is probably the worst one, seeking solitude. We need to separate ourselves from an ever-connected, always noisy world. I mean, think about it. How do you gain adulation from others if there's no one there to give it? C.S. Lewis, I think, put the point sharply when he said, we live, in fact, in a world starved for solitude, silence, and privacy, and therefore starved for meditation and true friendship. It's easy to get distracted by the amount of noise and understand that we're just a mile wide, but an inch deep. In his essay, The Inner Ring, Lewis asks this of those who would fall prey to that desire. He says, think back, folks. In the whole of your life as you now remember it, has the desire to be on the right side of that invisible line, to be one of that in-group, so to speak, has the desire to be on the right side of that invisible line ever prompted you to any act or word on which, in the cold, small hours of a wakeful night, you can look back with satisfaction? Has ever the desire to be, I got to be with one of the cool people, or I got to be with these guys, or I got to be with, has that ever, when you're by yourself alone and reflecting on the morality of your actions, said that was the right choice or not? In heaven, in Revelation chapter 4, it says that we will receive glory. God will give us rewards, crowns. Matter of fact, there were 5 of them that the Bible talks about as rewards for all we do. And in Revelation chapter 4, we see the 24 elders with those crowns. Crowns are by definition a symbol of one's glory, made of gold, encrusted with jewels. They show expense. They're a frivolous head ornament. They don't keep your hair dry or keep your head warm. They are simply there to show power and prestige. But when God gives us those crowns, we should do as the 24 elders in Revelation 4 did. We turn around, and it says, the 24 elders fall down before the one seated on the throne and worship the one who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne and say, our Lord and God, you are worthy to receive glory and honor and power, because you have created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. That's the proper order of glory. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, that you have given us a wonderful opportunity to be used, to bless others, to show all the ways that you make these things possible. I am amazed that you choose to use us as the tools you do in order to achieve your ends. And what we want to do, Lord, is we want to take those victories. We want to recognize them. We should never not recognize them. But in recognizing them, Lord, we also want to lay them back at your feet and just ask, Father, did you see? We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.